The penthouse was still, the kind of quiet that made the city outside feel like another world. Lena lay on the king-sized bed, the black silk robe her husband had bought her in Paris slipping open as she reclined against the pillows. It was just past 9:30 p.m., and the master bedroom was bathed in the warm glow of the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago's skyline shimmered in the distance, but Lena's focus was inward, her body alive with a quiet, restless energy. The room carried the faint scent of lavender body oil, its calming aroma mingling with something warmer, deeper, that hung in the air. Her breath was steady but shallow, her movements unhurried, as if she were suspended in a moment that stretched and held its breath. The silk robe draped loosely, catching the light as it slipped open, the fabric cool against her skin. Her thoughts were distant, her body carrying a tension that demanded release. She let her head fall back, her fingers tracing slow, absent patterns over her stomach, her touch light but insistent. The city's glow painted soft streaks across her skin, the warmth of it seeping into her as she sank deeper into the rhythm. The quiet was broken by the sharp click of the door handle. Lena froze, her hands stilling mid-motion. Her eyes flew open, her heart skipping a beat as the sound registered. For a moment, she told herself it was nothing, just the building settling or the wind rattling the windows. But then came the heavy thud of a gym bag hitting the floor, and her stomach twisted in dread. Jared stood in the doorway, his frame outlined by the soft light from the hallway. He was dressed in gym clothes, his dark hair damp, his chest rising and falling as if he'd been running. His eyes, dark like his father's but softer, younger, locked onto hers, then flicked downward for the briefest of moments before darting away. The silence between them was thick, heavy, the kind that made the air feel too thin to breathe. The AC kicked on, stirring the hem of her robe and sending a cool breeze across her skin. Lena's cheeks burned, her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to sit up, pulling the robe closed with a sharp, deliberate motion. Jared's voice cracked, rough and unsteady. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Left my protein shake in here." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The mini fridge in his room was always stocked. Lena's throat tightened as she straightened, her fingers gripping the silk of her robe. "Your father's in Dubai until Friday," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. It was a statement, a reminder, though she wasn't sure who it was meant for, him or herself. Jared didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might say something else. But instead, he turned sharply, striding out of the room and slamming the door behind him. The sound reverberated through the penthouse, sharp and final. Lena sat frozen on the bed, her heart still racing, her fingers trembling against the silk of her robe. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, the heat in his eyes, the way they'd lingered for a moment too long. Her body felt alive in a way it hadn't in months, the tension coiled tight, refusing to dissipate. She glanced at the mirror on the wall, her reflection staring back at her. Her pupils were wide, her cheeks flushed, her lips slightly parted. She didn't look ashamed. No, it was something else entirely, something that made her stomach twist and her pulse quicken. Lena let out a shaky breath and lay back against the pillows, her fingers trailing absent-mindedly down her stomach. The tension was still there, but she didn't have the heart, or the courage, to finish what she'd started. Instead, she stared up at the ceiling, the city lights casting shifting patterns across the smooth surface. Her mind raced, replaying the moment over and over, the way Jared had looked at her, the way his voice had cracked, the way he'd fled as if the room were on fire. She rolled onto her side, curling into herself, the silk robe pooling around her. The penthouse was quiet again, save for the hum of the AC and the faint thud of her heartbeat in her ears. She closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts from her mind, but they lingered, stubborn and insistent. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, one thought refused to leave her. This wasn't over. 48 hours had passed since the incident in the bedroom, and the penthouse felt different, charged, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The dining table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the soft glow of the pendant light overhead. Between Lena and Jared sat takeout containers of Szechuan beef and dumplings, steam curling lazily from the lids. The scent of garlic and chili oil filled the room, but neither of them seemed to notice. Jared sat across from Lena, his knee bouncing incessantly under the table, rattling the chopsticks that lay untouched beside his plate. He hadn't looked at her directly since he'd walked in, his gaze fixed on his food or the table or the wall behind her. Lena, on the other hand, watched him carefully, her fingers idly swirling the Merlot in her glass, the wine's legs streaking the sides like faint crimson veins. The silence between them was heavy, the kind that felt like it might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. Lena took a slow sip of her wine, the bitterness of it sharp on her tongue, and decided to break it. "We should address it," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jared's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "Address what?" he muttered, stabbing at a dumpling with his fork. Soy sauce splattered onto the pristine linen tablecloth, but he didn't seem to notice. Lena leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the table, her gaze steady. "You've watched me like a hawk since that night. Like you're waiting for me to..." "To what?" he interrupted, his voice low and edged with something sharp. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his fork. "Touch myself again?" "Yeah, I am." The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered, and for a moment neither of them moved. Lena's pulse quickened, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. There was something in his stare, an intensity she hadn't seen before, something that made her stomach twist and her breath catch. She took another sip of her wine, the bitterness grounding her. "Your father hasn't touched me in 6 months," she said, the admission tasting sour on her tongue. It wasn't something she'd planned to say, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. Jared's expression flickered, something unreadable passing over his face. For a moment he looked away, his jaw tightening as if he were wrestling with his own thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "I broke up with Sarah because I kept imagining you when we..." He cut himself off, his jaw clenching, but the heat in his stare finished the sentence for him. Lena's heart skipped a beat, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected any of this. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in, the air thick with tension and something darker, something she wasn't ready to name. She set her glass down carefully, the sound of it hitting the table louder than she'd intended. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse raced. "My room, 10 p.m. We'll match rhythms, nothing more." Jared's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment he didn't respond, and she wondered if he would argue, if he would push for more. But then he nodded, just once, a sharp, decisive motion. The silence that followed was heavier than before, the weight of their agreement settling between them like a third presence at the table. Lena picked at her food, though she wasn't hungry, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't untangle. Jared didn't eat either, his knee still bouncing under the table, his gaze fixed on his plate. The dinner passed in a blur, the food growing cold as the tension in the room thickened. When they finally cleared the table, neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something unspoken, something that felt inevitable. As Lena stood at the sink, rinsing her wine glass under the tap, she caught Jared's reflection in the window. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. She could feel the weight of it, the heat, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't turn around. Instead, she set the glass down carefully and dried her hands, her movements slow and deliberate. "Good night, Jared," she said, her voice calm but final. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment she wondered if he would say something, if he would try to push the boundaries they'd just set. But then he nodded, just once, and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lena stood in the kitchen for a long time after he'd gone, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, her mind racing. The penthouse was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. Charged. Waiting. She let out a shaky breath and turned off the lights, the darkness swallowing the room whole. As she walked down the hallway to her bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and Jared. Something irreversible. The next afternoon, the penthouse was bathed in golden sunlight, the kind that made everything feel warm and lazy. Lena moved through the space with deliberate slowness, her bare feet sinking into the plush rug as she bent to water the fiddle-leaf fig in the corner of the living room. She wore cut-off denim shorts and a cropped tank top, the fabric loose and casual, but the way it clung to her frame left little to the imagination. Jared sat on the couch, his textbook open in front of him, though he hadn't turned a page in nearly half an hour. His gaze followed her every move, his eyes dark and unreadable, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his thoughts. Lena could feel his stare hot and heavy, and she didn't mind. In fact, she leaned into it, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate, as she stretched to reach the top leaves of the plant. The hem of her shorts rode up as she bent forward, and she heard the sharp intake of breath behind her. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, but a small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips as she straightened and moved to the kitchen. The fridge was stocked with bottles of water, and she grabbed one, the plastic cool against her palm. She twisted the cap off and took a slow sip, the water spilling slightly as she tilted her head back. It ran down her chin, over her collarbones, and she gasped softly, more for effect than anything else. "Oops," she murmured, setting the bottle down and reaching for a paper towel. She didn't miss the way Jared's eyes followed the water trails, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "You're playing dirty," he muttered, his voice low and strained. Lena turned to face him, leaning casually against the counter. "I'm just thirsty," she replied, her tone innocent, though the glint in her eyes said otherwise. Her bare foot slid up his calf under the table, and he froze, his textbook forgotten. "Don't," he warned, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't what?" she asked, her tone light, her foot continuing its slow, teasing path up his leg. Jared's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes dark and intense. "You know what?" Lena smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that made his breath catch. She pulled her foot away and picked up her water bottle, leaving him sitting there, his textbook forgotten, his pulse racing. The afternoon passed in a blur of small, deliberate actions. Lena stretching to reach a high shelf, bending to pick up a dropped napkin, leaning over the counter to grab a pen. Each movement was calculated, designed to test Jared's resolve, and each time, she caught his gaze lingering, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to look away. By the time dinner rolled around, the tension between them was palpable, a thick, heavy thing that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. They ate in silence, the clink of cutlery against plates the only sound in the room. Lena's foot found his again under the table, and this time, he didn't pull away. When they finally cleared the table, neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something unspoken, something that felt inevitable. As Lena stood at the sink, rinsing her plate under the tap, she caught Jared's reflection in the window. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. She could feel the weight of it, the heat, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't turn around. Instead, she set the plate down carefully and dried her hands, her movements slow and deliberate. "My room, 10 p.m., remember?" she asked, her voice calm but final. He nodded just once and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The hour crept closer to 10, and Lena's bedroom was dimly lit, the only source of light the soft glow from the TV on the far wall. She sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the silk sheets. The air was thick with anticipation, the quiet hum of the AC doing little to ease the tension that had been building between her and Jared all day. The door creaked open, and Jared stepped inside, closing it softly behind him. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her bare legs, the thin strap of her nightgown slipping off one shoulder, the way she avoided his eyes. "We should," he started, but Lena cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "Sit," she said, her voice calm but firm, gesturing to the spot beside her on the bed. Jared hesitated for a moment before obeying, settling onto the mattress with a noticeable distance between them. The bed dipped under his weight, and Lena could feel the heat radiating from his body, even though they weren't touching. The remote trembled slightly in her hand as she pointed it at the TV, the screen flickering to life. The menu for Forbidden Family, Volume 12 appeared, the title bold and unapologetic. Lena's pulse jumped, her throat tightening as she clicked play. The grainy film began, the camera panning across a lavish bedroom before settling on a woman in her 40s, her lace teddy leaving little to the imagination. She leaned against a desk, her hips swaying as she addressed the young man seated on the bed, her stepson. "Let me teach you about anatomy," the actress purred, her voice low and sultry. Lena's breath hitched, her fingers gripping the sheets tightly as the scene unfolded. The tension between her and Jared was palpable, the air thick with a kind of electricity that made it hard to breathe. She could feel his gaze on her, hot and heavy, but she didn't look away from the screen. The actress moaned softly, her words punctuated with gasps. "Just like that, baby," she murmured, her fingers trailing down her body. Beside her, Jared shifted, his breathing uneven. Lena dared a glance in his direction and saw him fumbling with the waistband of his boxers. She looked away quickly, her cheeks burning, but the sound of fabric hitting the floor made her pulse race. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for the hem of her nightgown. The fabric whispered against her skin as she pulled it off, leaving her in nothing but a pair of cotton lingerie. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, before letting them fall to the floor. Jared's groan vibrated through the mattress, and Lena's breath caught at the sound. She could feel him watching her, his gaze burning into her skin, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she focused on the TV, her hand moving slowly, tentatively, as she tried to mimic the actress's movements. The room was quiet except for the sound of their breathing, ragged and uneven, and the faint hum of the TV. Lena's pulse thudded in her ears, her body alive with a kind of tension she hadn't felt in years. She could feel Jared beside her, his movements mirroring hers, the heat radiating from his body making it hard to think. The actress on the screen let out a sharp cry, her body arching as she reached the peak. Lena's breath hitched, her own body trembling as she followed suit. Beside her, Jared let out a low sound, and Lena's eyes flicked toward him involuntarily. His eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw clenched, his body taut with tension. The silence that followed was heavy, the air thick with a kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. Lena's body still trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. "Go to bed," she said, her voice shaky but firm. Jared hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking to her hand. He looked away quickly, his cheeks flushing as he stood and grabbed his boxers, pulling them on with unsteady hands. He didn't say anything as he left, closing the door softly behind him. Lena sat frozen on the bed, her mind racing, her body still humming with the remnants of what had just happened. She glanced at her fingers and felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, the thought of Jared's gaze lingering on them, even for a moment. The TV flickered, the credits rolling, but Lena didn't move. She sat there staring at the screen, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't untangle. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting a warm golden glow over the sleek modern kitchen. Lena sat at the marble island, her coffee cup cradled between her hands, the steam curling lazily into the air. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the buttery aroma of toast, but her breakfast sat untouched, her mind still reeling from the previous night. Jared stood across from her, his back to her as he buttered a slice of toast with deliberate slowness. The silence between them was heavy, charged with a kind of tension that made the air feel too thin to breathe. Lena's gaze flicked to him, her eyes tracing the lines of his broad shoulders, the way his muscles shifted under his t-shirt as he moved. She forced herself to look away, focusing on her coffee instead. The events of last night played on a loop in her mind, the grainy film, the sound of his breathing, the heat of his gaze. Her cheeks burned at the memory, and she took a slow sip of her coffee, hoping the bitterness would ground her. "I want to watch you finish tonight," Jared said suddenly, his voice low but firm. Lena's coffee cup clattered against the marble counter, spilling a few drops of the dark liquid onto the pristine surface. Her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at him. "That wasn't the deal," she protested, her voice shaky. Jared turned to face her, his gaze locking onto hers. He licked butter off his thumb, the gesture slow and deliberate, and Lena's stomach twisted at the sight. "Deals change," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The air between them crackled with tension, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the silence. Lena's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to find the right response. She opened her mouth to argue, to remind him of the boundaries they'd set, but the words caught in her throat. Jared's gaze didn't waver, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made it hard to think. "Well?" he prompted, his voice rough. Lena hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. The thought of him watching her, his eyes tracing every movement, sent a shiver down her spine. It was too much, too personal, too dangerous. But she couldn't deny the heat that coiled in her stomach at the idea. She started, her voice faltering. She looked away, her gaze dropping to the spilled coffee on the counter. "I'll think about it." Jared didn't respond immediately, and for a moment the silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken. Then he nodded, just once, and turned back to the toaster, grabbing another slice of bread. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, though. It hung in the air, thick and electric, as Lena sat frozen at the counter, her coffee growing cold in her hands. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of awkward silences and stolen glances. Lena tried to focus on her work, her laptop open in front of her, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Jared, to the way he'd looked at her over breakfast, the heat in his gaze, the way his voice had sent a shiver down her spine. Jared, for his part, seemed determined to act as if nothing had happened. He moved through the penthouse with his usual casual grace, his gym bag slung over his shoulder as he headed out for his morning workout. But Lena caught the way his gaze lingered on her, the way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. By the time evening rolled around, the tension between them was unbearable, a kind of static energy that made the air feel charged. Lena found herself pacing the living room, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't untangle. When the clock struck 10, Jared knocked softly on her bedroom door, his presence filling the room as he stepped inside. Lena stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest, her heart pounding in her chest. "Well?" he prompted, his voice low and rough. Lena hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to his face. The intensity in his eyes made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The evening air in the penthouse was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that made the walls feel closer, the silence heavier. Lena sat on the couch, the remote clutched loosely in her hand, her fingers tracing the edge of it nervously. Jared lounged beside her, his posture casual but his gaze sharp, the kind of look that made her pulse quicken without him needing to say a word. The TV hummed softly, its glow casting faint light across the room. They'd agreed to meet at 9, though the word agreed didn't quite capture the push and pull between them. Lena had tried to convince herself this was just another night, but the memory of the previous evening, Jared's unrelenting gaze, the way his breath had hitched as he watched her, was impossible to shake. It lingered, a shadow that followed her every move. "Another film?" Jared asked, his tone casual, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. Lena hesitated before nodding. She clicked through the menu, her throat tightening as the title "Mature Solitaire" appeared on the screen. The thumbnail alone made her stomach twist, a woman with a knowing smile, her posture inviting, her confidence radiating even in the stillness of the image. Jared didn't comment, but Lena could feel his eyes on her as she pressed play. The film began with a slow pan of a bedroom, the camera lingering on the woman as she reclined on a bed. She was dressed in a silk robe, the fabric slipping open as she stretched, her fingers trailing lazily over her skin. The actress's gaze was direct, her smile sultry as she addressed the camera. "Sometimes," she purred, "a woman needs to take care of herself." Lena's breath hitched, her grip tightening on the remote. She could feel Jared's presence beside her, his body radiating heat, his attention fixed on the screen. The actress's movements grew more deliberate, her touch more purposeful, and Lena's pulse quickened as the woman's breathing hitched. "Copy her," Jared said suddenly, his voice low but firm. Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Copy her," Jared repeated, his tone unyielding. When she hesitated, he added, "Or I walk." The words hung between them, heavy and final, and Lena's stomach twisted. She could feel his gaze on her, hot and expectant, and she knew he wasn't bluffing. Slowly, reluctantly, she set the remote down, her hands trembling as she reached for the hem of her nightgown. The fabric slid off her shoulders, pooling at her waist before she let it fall completely. She hesitated for a moment, her cheeks burning, before removing the last barrier between her and the weight of Jared's stare. The actress on the screen moved with a rhythm that was impossible to ignore, her body arching as her touch grew more insistent. Lena's breath hitched as she tried to match the motions, her movements tentative at first, but growing steadier as she lost herself in the act. Jared's choked gasp was all the confirmation she needed that he was watching. The room was quiet except for the sound of their breathing, ragged and uneven, and the faint hum of the TV. "Keep going," Jared said, his voice rough. Lena obeyed, her body trembling as the tension coiled tighter. The actress's moans filled the room, low and sultry, and Lena's breath hitched as she followed suit. When she finally reached her peak, her body arching as the tension snapped, she heard Jared's low groan beside her. He moved suddenly, his hands gripping her arms as he pulled her toward him. His kiss was sudden, messy, his teeth scraping her lip as his tongue invaded her mouth. Lena's mind raced, but she didn't resist. Instead, she kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair as he dragged her off the couch and toward his room. The bedroom was softly lit by the pale glow of the city outside the window. Shadows stretched across the space, casting long, uneven shapes on the walls. The atmosphere felt heavy, charged with a kind of quiet energy that made the room seem smaller than it was. Lena sat on the edge of the bed, her body still humming faintly from what had just happened in the living room. The sheet lay loosely around her legs, her fingers absently fidgeting with the edge of it as she tried to steady herself. Her body, lean and strong from years of discipline, was tense, every muscle tight as if holding itself together. Jared stood a few feet away, his back to her as he tugged off his shirt. The faint light caught the lines of his shoulders, tracing the contours of his frame as he moved. His breathing was uneven, his motions careful but not quite smooth, as though he were fighting to keep himself in check. When he turned to face her, his eyes locked onto hers, dark, intense, and filled with something that made her stomach tighten. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was loaded, the kind that felt like it might crack if someone moved too suddenly. Jared took a step toward her, then another, his bare feet quiet against the floor. His gaze stayed fixed on her, and Lena found it hard to look away. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and slightly rough. Lena paused, her fingers tightening around the sheet. Her thoughts raced, a jumble of uncertainty and want that made it hard to focus. "Are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jared didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the distance between them in a few steps, his hands landing on her shoulders as he gently pushed her back onto the bed. Lena felt her body sink into the mattress, his weight settling over her, solid and warm. "I've been sure for weeks," he said, his lips brushing against her ear. His voice was soft but firm, the words sending a faint warmth through her. It was quick, their movements rushed and almost frantic, as though they were both afraid the moment might slip away. Jared's hands moved over her, his touch firm but not unkind, leaving a trail of heat wherever they went. Lena's fingers dug into his back, her breathing uneven as she let herself be pulled into the rhythm of it. When it was over, Jared slumped against her, his chest rising and falling as he tried to catch his breath. Lena lay still, her fingers tracing faint patterns on his skin, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Jared shifted slightly, his head resting on her chest, his breath warm against her skin. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Lena nodded, her fingers running through his hair. It was soft, slightly damp from sweat, and the sensation grounded her. "Yeah," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. Jared raised himself up on his elbows, his dark eyes searching hers. "You're not," he said, his tone more statement than question. Lena swallowed, her gaze dropping to the hollow of his throat. "It's just complicated," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jared reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. The gesture was unexpectedly gentle, and it made her chest feel tight. "Complicated doesn't mean wrong," he said, his voice steady. Lena looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, but she didn't respond. Instead, she let her fingers trail down his arm, her touch light but certain. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his body still seemed alive with energy, and it stirred something in her. Jared's gaze softened as he studied her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "We can stop if you want," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But if we keep going—" He paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I can do this all night." The words sent a faint warmth through her, the tone of his voice making her stomach tighten. Lena hesitated, her thoughts racing. She knew she should pull back, should end this before it went any further. But the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the room, maybe the only thing in the world, made it hard to resist. The second thing was slower, more focused. Jared's hands moved over her body with a kind of care, his touch bringing a steady warmth to her skin. He spoke her name, the sound low and soft, and it made her heart race. His whispered words, "Knew you'd feel this good," caught her off guard, the quiet intensity in his voice sending a faint flutter through her. Lena's fingers moved lightly over his back, the sensation grounding her as they found their rhythm again. The room was quiet except for the sound of their breathing and the faint creak of the bed beneath them. When it was over, they lay together in the darkness, their bodies tangled together, their breathing slowly evening out. Jared's arm was draped over her waist, his head resting on her chest, and Lena stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The penthouse walls seemed to hold their secret, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just shared. Lena's body still felt warm, her skin tingling faintly where Jared had touched her, her thoughts a jumble of guilt, desire, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. Jared shifted beside her, his breath warm against her skin as he pressed a faint kiss to her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Lena paused, her fingers tracing faint patterns on his arm. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Jared didn't respond right away, his silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Instead, he tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer against him. The warmth of his body was comforting, steadying, and Lena closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the moment. The room was quiet, the city outside a faint hum, but the weight of what they'd done lingered, a shadow that neither could ignore. Lena's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of guilt, desire, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to face. Jared's breathing evened out, his body relaxed against hers, but Lena lay awake, staring up at the ceiling, the reality of what had happened pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. The morning light filtered through the large windows of the penthouse, casting a soft, golden glow across the open living space. The city below was already awake, its distant hum a faint backdrop to the quiet stillness of the room. Lena stood by the kitchen island, dressed in one of Jared's oversized shirts, her hair loosely tied back. Her body felt loose, Her muscles relaxed in a way they hadn't been in a long time. Jared moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, his movements smooth and practiced as he prepared breakfast. The scent of coffee and freshly toasted bread filled the air, mingling with the faint citrus of the juice he'd poured into 2 glasses. He glanced up at her, his dark eyes catching hers for a moment before he looked back at the skillet in front of him. "You want eggs?" he asked, his voice casual, as though the previous night hadn't happened. Lena nodded, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. "Scrambled," she said, her voice a little softer than she intended. "Got it." Jared cracked a couple of eggs into a bowl, whisking them with a fork before pouring them into the skillet. The sizzle of the eggs filled the silence between them, the sound oddly comforting. Lena watched him for a moment, her gaze tracing the lines of his shoulders, the way his muscles shifted under the thin fabric of his t-shirt. She cleared her throat, breaking the quiet. "So, about last night?" Jared glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "What about it?" Lena hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Was that just a one-time thing?" Jared turned the stove off, setting the fork down on the counter before he faced her fully. His gaze was steady, his expression serious. "Do you want it to be a one-time thing?" Lena opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what she wanted, wasn't sure how to untangle the mess of emotions swirling inside her. Before she could say anything, Jared crossed the space between them, his hand landing on the counter beside her, caging her in. "Because it doesn't have to be," he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. Lena felt her breath hitch, her body responding instinctively to his closeness. "Jared?" Before she could finish, he lifted her effortlessly onto the marble counter, her legs instinctively parting to make room for him as he stepped between them. His hands settled on her hips, his grip firm but not rough, and Lena felt a faint warmth spread through her as he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a slow, teasing kiss. "I'm not done with you," he murmured against her mouth, his voice thick with a kind of hunger that made her stomach tighten. Lena's hands found his shoulders, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as he kissed her again, in a way that left her head spinning. When he pulled back, his gaze was dark, intense, and filled with something that made her heart race. And then he dropped to his knees. As Jared knelt before her, Lena felt a sudden rush of warmth, her hands instinctively gripping his shoulders for balance. His hands moved slowly up her legs, pushing the fabric of the shirt up just enough to expose more of her skin. His lips brushed against her, the touch light but deliberate, sending a wave of heat through her. "Jared," she began, but the words faded into a soft, unsteady sound as his mouth found its place. The sensation was overwhelming, a mix of tenderness and intensity that left her clinging to him, her fingers pressing into his shoulders. It wasn't long before the pressure within her built, her body responding to his touch with an undeniable urgency. When it finally peaked, she leaned into him, her breathing uneven as she tried to steady herself. Jared rose slowly, his hands trailing back down her legs as he leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both gentle and commanding. When he pulled back, his eyes met hers, his expression serious, his gaze unyielding. "This doesn't have to end," he said, his voice low but firm. Lena looked up at him, her chest still rising and falling unevenly. "What does that mean?" Jared's hands settled on her hips again, his grip steady. "It means we can keep doing this, as long as we both want to." Lena hesitated, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. "And when one of us doesn't want to anymore?" "Then it ends," Jared said, his tone matter-of-fact. "No hard feelings." Lena looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any hint that he wasn't being completely honest. But his gaze was steady, his expression open, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of certainty. "Okay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jared's lips curved into a faint smile, his hands tightening on her hips as he leaned in, brushing his lips against hers in a kiss that was both promise and reassurance. "Okay," he echoed, his voice low and warm. As he pulled back, Lena felt a faint sense of relief wash over her, the weight of uncertainty lifting slightly. She wasn't sure what this was, wasn't sure where it would lead, but for now, it was enough. For now, she was willing to see where it would go. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and quiet understanding. Lena and Jared fell into a rhythm, their connection deepening despite the unspoken boundaries they'd set. They didn't talk about the future, didn't label what was happening between them. Instead, they simply existed in the space they'd created, a world of soft touches and lingering glances, of whispered words and shared breaths. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in hues of orange and pink, Lena found herself standing by the large windows. The view was breathtaking, the city alive and buzzing below, but her attention was elsewhere. Jared stood behind her, his arms wrapped loosely around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You're quiet today," he murmured, his voice low and warm against her ear. Lena leaned back into him, her hands resting on his arms. "Just thinking," she said softly. Jared pressed a kiss to the side of her neck, his lips lingering for a moment. "About?" Lena hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "About us," she admitted. Jared's arms tightened around her, his breath warm against her skin. "What about us?" Lena turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. "Where does this go, Jared? What happens next?" Jared's gaze softened, his fingers brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "It goes wherever we want it to," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have to figure it all out right now." Lena searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, but there was none. His eyes were clear, his expression open, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. "Okay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jared's lips curved into a faint smile, his hands settling on her hips as he leaned in, brushing his lips against hers in a kiss that was both promise and reassurance. "Okay," he echoed, pulling her closer. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the city stretched out before them, alive and endless. Lena felt a sense of peace settle over her, the weight of uncertainty lifting slightly. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where this would lead, but for now, it was enough. For now, they were enough.